The morning of the accident started with weather that any pilot would call marginal at best. Ceilings hovering around 1,200 feet broken, visibility struggling to reach 5 miles through persistent drizzle, the kind of conditions that make you pause at the hangar door and really think about whether this flight needs to happen today. But here's the thing about marginal weather. It's not technically illegal. It's not even necessarily dangerous on its own. It's just one more layer of complexity in an environment that already demands precision. And on this particular morning, that extra layer would prove to be the difference between a manageable emergency and an unsurvivable tragedy. What's fascinating about this accident isn't just what went wrong, it's how the weather transformed every single decision point into something exponentially more difficult. You see, when visibility is good and ceilings are high, pilots have options. They have time to think, space to maneuver, and most importantly, they have visual references that help them understand exactly where they are and what their airplane is doing. Take those references away, wrap everything in a gray shroud of moisture and uncertainty, and suddenly even simple tasks become complex calculations. And complex tasks, well, they can become nearly impossible. The Citation that Greg Biffle and his friends were flying that morning is a capable machine. It's designed to handle single-engine operations. It's equipped for instrument flight. It has redundancies built into almost every system. But here's what the weather does to all those capabilities. It doesn't eliminate them. It just makes accessing them exponentially harder. Think about it this way. Imagine you're driving down a familiar road, and suddenly, fog rolls in so thick you can barely see past your hood. Now imagine at that exact moment, your engine starts making a strange noise. Your steering feels different, and you need to make a critical turn that you can't quite see. That's essentially what happened 10 minutes into this flight, except they were moving at nearly 200 knots and had no shoulder to pull over on. Let me paint you the complete picture here, because understanding what happened requires understanding not just the mechanical issues or the weather separately, but how they interacted in ways that created a perfect storm of complications. The flight departed runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport, climbing into those 1,200-foot ceilings I mentioned. Now, 1,200 feet might sound like a lot, but in a Citation climbing at several thousand feet per minute, that's less than 30 seconds from ground to clouds, less than 30 seconds to establish your climb, configure your aircraft, and transition from visual flying to instrument flying. That's a critical transition even on a perfect day. But when something goes wrong in those first few moments, that transition becomes a juggling act where you're already dropping balls before you even know how many you're supposed to be catching. The evidence suggests that shortly after liftoff, possibly as the nose pitched up for climb, the right-hand nose baggage door came open. Now, this isn't immediately catastrophic. Planes have landed safely with open doors before. But what makes this particular door so dangerous is its location directly in front of the right engine. When that door opens, it's not just creating drag and noise, it's potentially feeding debris directly into an engine intake. And here's where the weather starts its deadly multiplication effect. In clear conditions, the crew might have immediately seen the door, understood the threat, and made rapid decisions about configuration and return routing. But climbing into clouds, with visibility already restricted, that visual confirmation becomes impossible. All they have is noise, vibration, maybe some performance degradation, symptoms that could mean a dozen different things. The radio transmissions that were captured, and there's still debate about their authenticity, but the technical analysis suggests they're real. These transmissions paint a picture of a crew that knew they had an issue, but were still trying to figure out exactly what that issue was. The voice, which sounds young and has been speculated to be Jack Dutton, mentions they have an issue. They're getting their gear down. They're returning to the field. But notice what's not said. There's no specific identification of the problem, no declaration of which engine might be affected, no clear statement of their intentions beyond returning. This ambiguity isn't necessarily unusual in the first moments of an emergency. Crews often need time to assess and understand what they're dealing with. But when you're already in marginal weather, that assessment time is time you're burning through altitude and options. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the weather really starts to compound every decision. The aircraft initially climbs to about 2,000 feet, then begins a descent while simultaneously reducing airspeed. This is consistent with the crew trying to stay below the clouds while also keeping their speed low, possibly to prevent further damage to the baggage door. But here's the trap they're falling into without realizing it. By staying low to maintain visual contact with the ground, they're limiting their energy reserves. By slowing down to protect against structural damage, they're reducing their performance margins. And by doing both simultaneously in weather that's barely visual, they're painting themselves into a corner where every subsequent decision has fewer good options. The flight path data shows something really interesting here. The aircraft appears to make multiple heading changes, first appearing to line up for a return to runway 10, then changing to attempt an approach to runway 28. Some have interpreted this as confusion or poor planning, but I see something different. I see a crew trying to find visual references in deteriorating conditions. When you're scud running, which is aviation speak for flying below clouds in marginal weather, you're constantly trading altitude for visibility. You descend a bit to get below a cloud layer, but then terrain or obstacles force you back up. You turn toward clearer air, but that takes you away from your intended path. It's exhausting, demanding work that requires constant attention and leaves no mental bandwidth for handling other emergencies. Dan Greider's analysis mentions something crucial that often gets overlooked. He points out that the citation with gear down and full flaps simply cannot maintain altitude on a single engine, especially at maximum weight. The aircraft that morning was loaded with 5 people, likely baggage, and fuel for their intended flight. That puts them right at the edge of single-engine performance capability, even in perfect conditions. Add in the drag from an open baggage door, the performance degradation from possible engine damage, and the need to maneuver in limited visibility, and you have an equation that simply doesn't balance. The aircraft needs more energy than it can generate. But here's what's truly insidious about the weather's role in this. In clear conditions with high ceilings, the crew could have climbed to 3,000 or 4,000 feet, engaged the autopilot, and bought themselves time. Time to run checklists, time to assess their situation, time to coordinate with air traffic control for vectors to a longer runway or better conditions. The weather stole that option from them. By forcing them to stay low, it kept them in a high workload environment, where every second required active flying, active navigation, active decision-making. There was no pause button, no moment to step back and really understand what they were dealing with. The configuration changes are particularly telling. The early extension of landing gear and flaps suggests the crew is trying to prepare for an immediate landing. In good weather, this might be a reasonable decision. Get configured early, fly a stable approach, minimize last-minute changes. But in marginal conditions, early configuration is a commitment you can't easily reverse. Once that gear comes down, once those flaps extend, the aircraft becomes a very expensive glider if you lose thrust. The drag increases exponentially, and your ability to climb or even maintain altitude degrades rapidly. It's like putting on a parachute while you're still trying to climb a mountain. It might save you later, but right now it's making every step harder. What really strikes me about this accident is how the weather transformed what should have been manageable workload into an overwhelming cascade of demands. Consider what the crew was dealing with simultaneously. They had an unknown mechanical issue creating noise and vibration. They had degraded performance from either an open door, engine damage, or both. They had marginal visibility requiring constant visual scanning and interpretation. They had to navigate back to the airport without clear visual references. They had to configure the aircraft for landing while managing abnormal performance. They had to coordinate between potentially 3 pilots on board about who was doing what. And they had to do all of this in about 10 minutes because that's all the time they had from takeoff to impact. The human factors here are crucial and deeply affected by the weather conditions. Under stress, human performance degrades in predictable ways. We get tunnel vision, literally and figuratively. We fixate on immediate threats and lose sight of bigger pictures. We revert to practiced patterns even when those patterns don't fit the current situation. In good weather, these degradations are manageable because we have external references to keep us oriented. But in marginal conditions, when those external references are compromised, we can quickly lose situational awareness without realizing it's happening. The crew composition adds another layer of complexity that the weather amplified. Dennis Dutton, the most experienced pilot on board, was qualified to fly the Citation but required a second-in-command. His son Jack had a private pilot certificate with a recent instrument rating, but no multi-engine rating and no Citation type rating. Greg Biffle had a multi-engine rating, but would have needed specific Citation familiarization to legally act as second-in-command. In good weather, these qualification gaps might not matter much. The experienced pilot can handle most situations while others assist as needed. But in marginal weather with an emergency developing, you need every seat filled with someone who can contribute meaningfully to managing the crisis. The weather turned what might have been acceptable credential flexibility into a critical vulnerability. There's something particularly tragic about the distance numbers. The aircraft flew for about 10 minutes and covered 26 miles. Charlotte Douglas International Airport, with its long runways, sophisticated approach systems, and emergency equipment, was only 32 miles away. In clear weather, the crew might have elected to continue to Charlotte, buying themselves time and options. But in marginal conditions, the urge to get back on the ground quickly becomes overwhelming. You can see the airport you departed from, or at least you think you can. You know the approach, you know the runway, you know the terrain. The familiar becomes a magnet, even when better options might exist just beyond the weather. The witness accounts add texture to how challenging the conditions were. Multiple pilots who were in the area that day have commented on various forums about the weather. They described conditions that were technically legal, but practically challenging. The kind of day where you're constantly evaluating and reevaluating whether to continue. One pilot who was on the ground at Statesville reported that visibility was variable, with patches of better and worse conditions moving through. This variability is especially dangerous because it creates false hope. You see a break in the weather and think conditions are improving, so you press on, only to find yourself in worse conditions moments later. The ADS-B data tells a story of increasing desperation masked by the weather's obscuration. The filtered data shows relatively normal flight parameters initially, followed by increasingly erratic altitude and speed changes. Some have speculated about control issues or struggles in the cockpit, but I think the more likely explanation is a crew trying to maintain visual contact with the ground while simultaneously managing degraded aircraft performance. Every descent to get below clouds costs energy. Every turn to avoid worse weather costs distance. Every configuration change to prepare for landing costs performance. And in marginal weather, you can't see the cumulative effect of these costs until it's too late to pay the bill. The single-engine procedures for the Citation assume certain conditions. They assume you have altitude to trade for time. They assume you have clear routing to a suitable runway. They assume you have the mental bandwidth to execute checklists and procedures methodically. The weather that morning violated all these assumptions. It compressed the crew into a narrow band of altitude between the clouds and the ground. It obscured the visual routing back to the airport. And most critically, it demanded so much attention just for basic flying that there was little left for emergency management. The audio recording, if authentic, reveals something heartbreaking about the crew's state of mind. The voice is calm, professional, trying to communicate their situation without causing panic. They mention having an issue, getting things going, getting gear down. These aren't the words of a crew that's given up or panicked. They're the words of pilots still fighting, still believing they can make it work. But the weather had already stacked the deck against them in ways they might not have fully realized. Every calm, professional decision they made was being multiplied by conditions that turned reasonable choices into irreversible commitments. There's a concept in aviation called the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. The idea is that hazards are like holes in slices of Swiss cheese. Most of the time, the holes don't line up, and hazards are caught by various defensive layers. But occasionally, all the holes align, and an accident becomes inevitable. The weather that morning wasn't just another slice of cheese. It was more like a force that pushed all the other slices together, aligning holes that might otherwise have remained separated. The baggage door, the crew qualifications, the engine vulnerability, the airport proximity, the aircraft weight, all of these factors might have been manageable individually, but the weather compressed them into a single, overwhelming challenge. The decision to attempt a return to runway 28 instead of continuing to runway 10 reveals the insidious nature of marginal weather decision-making. In clear conditions, the crew could have made a visual assessment of which runway offered the best approach path. They could have seen wind indicators, judged distances accurately, and committed to a plan with confidence. But in reduced visibility, every decision becomes a guess based on incomplete information. The multiple heading changes recorded in the flight path suggest a crew that kept revising their plan as new information became available, or as previous assumptions proved incorrect. This constant replanning is mentally exhausting and time-consuming, two resources they couldn't afford to spend. The configuration timeline is particularly telling when viewed through the lens of weather impact. The early extension of gear and flaps suggests the crew believed they were closer to landing than they actually were. This is a common illusion in reduced visibility. Distances appear shorter, closure rates seem faster, and the urge to configure early becomes strong because you're afraid of being rushed later. But in a degraded performance scenario, early configuration is like putting on ankle weights during a marathon. It might seem like preparation, but it's actually making the remaining challenge exponentially harder. What happened in those final minutes was likely a terrible realization that the energy equation no longer balanced. The aircraft, configured for landing and dealing with asymmetric thrust or complete engine failure, simply couldn't maintain altitude. The weather prevented them from seeing this developing until visual contact with the ground made it obvious they weren't going to make the runway. By then, the laws of physics had taken over. There was no thrust available to overcome the drag, no altitude to trade for distance, no time to reconfigure for better performance. The weather had hidden this mathematical certainty until the moment it became visually apparent and tragically irreversible. The investigation will ultimately provide technical details about what failed and when. They'll analyze the engine teardown, examine the baggage door latching mechanism, review the cockpit voice recorder to understand crew actions and communications. But what they might not fully capture is how the weather transformed a series of manageable problems into an impossible equation. It wasn't just that visibility was reduced or ceilings were low, it was that these conditions fundamentally changed the nature of every challenge the crew faced, multiplying complexity, reducing options, and compressing time until there simply wasn't enough of anything left to work with. The lessons from this accident extend beyond just weather flying or emergency procedures. They're about understanding how environmental conditions don't just add difficulty, they fundamentally change the nature of the challenges we face. A baggage door opening in clear weather is a different emergency than a baggage door opening in marginal conditions. An engine failure at altitude is a different problem than an engine failure while scud running. Crew coordination between qualified pilots is different than coordination when qualifications are mixed and weather is demanding everyone's attention. The weather didn't cause this accident, but it transformed what might have been a successful emergency return into a tragedy. For those of us in aviation, this accident reinforces some hard truths about marginal weather operations. When conditions are barely legal, we're already operating with reduced margins. Add any complication, any abnormal situation, any unexpected development, and those margins can evaporate faster than we can recognize and respond. The decision to launch into marginal weather isn't just about whether we can legally do it or whether we've done it before successfully. It's about whether we can handle the worst case scenario when those conditions multiply every other challenge we might face. The final approach path shows an aircraft that almost made it. They were just 1,800 feet short of the runway when impact occurred. In clear weather, the crew might have recognized the energy deficit earlier and made different choices. They might have accepted a landing on a taxiway or even a controlled off-airport landing with better survivability prospects. But the weather hid these options until the very last moments, when physics and geography converged into an outcome that no amount of skill or determination could overcome. As we wait for the NTSB's preliminary and final reports, we're left with a stark reminder of how quickly aviation can transition from routine to emergency to tragedy. The weather that morning wasn't prohibitive. It wasn't even particularly unusual for that time of year in North Carolina, but it was just bad enough to transform a mechanical issue into an overwhelming crisis. It turned what should have been 10 minutes of challenging flying into 10 minutes where every decision had to be perfect, every assessment had to be instant, and every margin had to be stretched to its limit. And in the end, the weather's greatest cruelty wasn't what it prevented the crew from doing, it was what it prevented them from seeing until it was too late to matter. This accident will be studied and analyzed for years to come. Procedures will be reviewed, training will be enhanced, and perhaps regulations will be modified. But the fundamental lesson remains constant and unforgiving. Weather doesn't just make flying harder, it fundamentally changes the nature of the risks we face. It transforms manageable emergencies into compound crises. It turns adequate margins into insufficient buffers. And most tragically, it hides the true nature of our situation until reality becomes undeniable and irreversible. The fog that morning didn't cause the crash, but it made sure that once things started going wrong, there would be no path back to safety.